Hello and welcome to The Hero Spouse. I'm Kendra Ruth, here to answer one of your questions about marriage and midlife crisis. Today we have an anonymous female left behind a forward-moving spouse with a bomb drop of January 10th, 2022 and a date of marriage of 2005. She has an at-home MLCer who is a clinging boomerang. She says, "Your videos are amazing and have helped me understand so much more because I won't leave his side while he processes and works through his horrible thing that he's dealing with." In section 2 of Understanding Midlife Crisis, you talk about escape and avoid and then liminality. I believe he already was starting his midlife crisis in January of 2021. His mom then died traumatically and unexpectedly on August 1st, 2021. Before his mom's death, he thought he could get back on track with healthy habits to try and correct whatever it was he was feeling. Active lifestyle, healthy eating, listening to podcasts. Then, when his mom passed away, things understandably got worse. In your videos, you speak about childhood trauma and other types of traumas. Am I correct in assuming that his mom's death could be a trauma that could also trigger a midlife crisis? So, what we're doing is, technically, yes, but I'm going to actually say no, because we are misunderstanding the term trigger and root causes, triggers and roots. So a parent's death is the standard trigger for a midlife crisis, but you're actually asking about root causes and you're using the term trigger. Those traumas that you have asked about in your videos, I speak about childhood traumas and other types of traumas. Those are root causes. Those things that are root causes go into causing a midlife crisis. And a cause of a midlife crisis is different than something that triggers a midlife crisis. So things that cause a midlife crisis were already kind of written into the book of who you are very early on. Something that triggers it, it was already going to be triggered. It was already set. So it was going to trigger now, or it was going to trigger at a different time. So it was going to happen when his mom died now, or if something else happened a few months later, or a few months later, or a few months later, or a few years later. Something was going to flip that switch based on those things that were rooted in the earlier childhood traumas. Or it could have been traumas from military service, but long-standing things that have really eroded somebody's levels of resilience, causing a lot of PTSD, typically. We don't always see that, but that is what is really common. So let's look at what that means and why then. So, looking at development over the life cycle. Think of development as blocks, but we're going to make those blocks Swiss cheese. So Swiss cheese has holes in it, doesn't it? Or if you're making candles even, and if you're making candles where you do the wax and you have ice cubes in it to make pretty candles that have holes in it, that kind of thing. So you have gaps where those holes are. Those gaps are the places of trauma, where there was a trauma and something was missing in that development. So you go through your life and you build in blocks, blocks on top of blocks on top of blocks. But they're sitting on top of each other, and there are places of weakness because of those gaps. And think about building a structure where you have these areas of weakness, and that structure is weak now in those gaps. And then something happens, and a certain type of trigger is going to come along, and it is going to flip a switch that harkens back to something that has to do with that developmental gap. It causes a reminiscence about that time period, perhaps. So the parent's death, maybe it brings back something from the time of age 17. Some form of lack of closure with father when father dies. I bring that one up because dad's death is a very common one. So, and 17, I bring up 17 because 17 is the standard age we see MLCers regress to. And they have to then reintegrate things from that time period of development. So those gaps have come back. They've kind of bubbled up. They are in our shadow. They're in our shadow self. They're a part of us. And they've just bubbled to the surface, and that trigger has brought them forward. And that's why there's a cause and a trigger. And they are two different things, but they are very related. And we use those two different terms. So his mom's death, especially as a traumatic death, more so, but mom's death would maybe have done it anyway, especially sudden. And you're saying that he was probably going in a midlife crisis anyways, and maybe he was going in, maybe it was a midlife transition. Midlife, we all go through a midlife transition if we survive long enough. And there's nothing good or bad, or it's just part of life, just like we go through teenage years. But he got to a tipping point with that trigger of mom's death could have tipped him over, and maybe he was close, or maybe he was getting there. Maybe he was close to it being crisis level. And like you said, he was trying to do some things that could work on himself. He was doing things specifically that were trying to get some insight. Healthy activities. So healthy activities such as active lifestyle, MLCers do that too. They go vanity, but they become active. Healthy eating, that can go with it because they lose a lot of weight. They get, but listening to podcasts, but then it got worse. Then he had something really happen, and he started to question himself. Who am I? What is my purpose? Why am I here? What's wrong with me? It really hit in here. The resilience, the trauma, the PTSD bubbled back in. And it probably hit in his anxiety kicked in. It kicked up his amygdala. He went into a panic. Fight or flight kicked in. And emotional dysregulation. So all sorts of things started to cascade in him. And that's what mom's death triggered. And that kicked what might have been a transition into a crisis. So the other question I'm going to have for you is, you said, I will not leave his side while he processes and works through his horrible thing he's dealing with. So I don't know what he's told you, and we may find out a little bit more, but I will not leave his side. Has he asked for space? He's an at-homer, so maybe he hasn't. MLCers often ask for space, so I want you to be very careful about making sure, and this is for everybody listening though also, that we are very careful that we listen to our MLCer and we give them space as well, rather than hover and smother, because MLCers also need space. Not leaving his side isn't the same as not giving up on them. So be really careful that we are giving the amount of space that they need while still believing in them. Okay, but I'm hoping that that can help you understand just those differences between root causes and triggers. And I hope this is helpful, and I will see everybody in the next question.